Trump just made headlines with some new restrictions for the hiring of H-1B employees, and most of the right wing, barring the tech right, has the same opinion on this matter, in that we want all these H-1Bs gone immediately. Sacrificing the soul of our country to boost the national GDP is not worth the trade. That reasoning alone is sufficient enough to end this debate. I do plan on eventually doing an objective deep dive on why H-1B is a total scam. But for now, instead of reviewing the metrics, I want to give some firsthand experience of what actually working with these people is truly like. Right-wing critics can certainly recite the data, but few really understand why these people are so unbelievably corrosive to a company's culture. Specifically, I want to talk about the Indian workers, which make up over 70% of H-1B visa recipients each year. I'm aware of these cultural downsides because I used to work at one of the most high-profile tech companies in the world, which also happens to be probably the main abuser of the H-1B program. Before I started, I had originally expected the work environment to be intense. I was certain that all employees there must be the most elite and competent people possible, and that the H-1B hires had to be absolutely exceptional to warrant their migration, because I naively assumed it had to be a massive burden to the companies to import them over. This was not at all the reality of the situation. The first hint to me that perhaps things were not as they seemed was simply the quantity of them. The specific division I worked in had absolutely no excuse for hiring non-Americans. Perhaps when I lose the anonymity on here, I'll tell the whole story. But half of my team was somehow made up of young Indian men. The proportion of them that were Indians, born in India, was just outrageous. And this was obviously not unique within the company. You would get on an interdivisional teams meeting and think you'd accidentally just joined the Galactic Senate Assembly. They all seemed nice enough at first. It was a very stale kindness, but I at least didn't see them as any sort of threat. They appeared harmless and docile. My perspective changed almost immediately. Since their ability to live in the US is predicated on maintaining their employment, they don't view their job in the same way as an American would. You would think that this pressure would make them hyper-competent and incredibly motivated to do a good job, whatever the cost. But what actually happens is they feel as if they must be cosplaying work at all times. There's no trust that reliability and competency will correlate to job security. Instead, they trap themselves in a slavish pantomime. And so they'll go through any effort just to portray that they're working, rather than being focused on achievement and handing over deliverables. I would regularly get emails between midnight and 4 a.m. with 80 plus people CC'd on them, but the email was always noting that the Indian was planning on setting up a meeting, or confirming another benign detail that the senior manager had talked about the day before. They would send these types of emails, which inherently had no urgency and didn't accomplish anything, purely in the hopes that during a team meeting the following day, the senior manager would give some type of acknowledgement to the fact that they were working like slaves, sending emails deep into the night. They relished in that. I cannot overstate how elated they would be when someone commented on how horrible their lives seemed. Totally masochistic. The office power dynamic to them was a zero-sum game. The team could not be collectively successful in their eyes. In order for an Indian to be praised, they felt it would have to be at the expense of another. Their brains seemed to not understand the concept of collective accomplishment, or teamwork for that matter. And because of this, you'd frequently see them email you about something you had said, after they noticed a small detail was wrong. And in this email, they would CC your boss and explain exactly why you were wrong about some trivial aspect of your comments. It did not matter how inconsequential it was. They never let an opportunity to make a correction go to waste. One of the most ridiculous things I saw was when one of our interns had written up and distributed the notes for a meeting of maybe 100 people. An hour later, an Indian had hit reply all to the email, addressed the intern directly, and let her, as well as everyone else, know that a completely irrelevant note was actually incorrect. The Indian had slashed a line through it and told her to update it for accuracy and redistribute it. But if anything you ever said made them look responsible for an error, they would lie about anything and everything to ensure the blame was redirected. The only chance you had at holding them to any commitment was if you had something in writing to be able to reference. But they were always calculated in how they phrased things in order to exonerate themselves down the line, or they would insist whatever language they had sent you didn't actually mean what it so obviously did. I often saw things which made me question their ability to do anything at all. That's not an exaggeration. If I had a one-on-one meeting to go over something a little more complex, I'd noticed a lack of understanding that was so fundamental, it became confusing how they even had the job to begin with, let alone the supposed education and experience their resume showed. I came to learn that these resumes were all complete concoctions. The best analogy for it, I think, is that it was like talking to a mechanic who accidentally just revealed he didn't know what a wrench was while he had your car hood up. They weren't just missing an elite, masterful understanding. They didn't know things which were so basic, it became apparent that everything they were doing must have been one massive shell game. They were also entirely unwilling to do anything outside of their scope, unless it was to impress a manager. In that case, they would very publicly announce they were taking on an additional burden, often codifying it with an email to 80 plus people. But if you asked them for any assistance at all, they had no problem telling you they would not be helping, and if they did, they would intentionally leave out information in order to screw you over down the line. If you took initiative to try and help them in good faith to reduce the collective load, they would explain to your manager behind your back that the responsibility of whatever you were helping with was now solely yours. They would wash their hands of it immediately without saying anything to you, and they'd do nothing to assist further. And since the things they would do were so passive and non-confrontational, you couldn't really call it out directly, because they would simply say they forgot if you asked why they left out critical information, or they'd claim there was simply a miscommunication. They love that word. I can't stress this enough. They have no interest in getting the job done. They only care about the presentation. They would also have Indians-only group chats on Teams. If they were involved in hiring, you could be sure that the next opening would be filled by another Indian. They openly hated whites, and America for that matter. Some of the company gear we wore came with American flags sewn onto them. One Indian had gone and torn this off, purchased an Indian flag, and stitched it over in the same spot. This caught like wildfire throughout the office. They were Indian and India first, always. I think what bothered me most, though, was that their behavior did trick a decent amount of managers. To a senior manager, they were basically given the most submissive, loyal slave imaginable. The higher-ups could do nothing wrong in their eyes. The Indians would defend them vocally at all times to everyone. There was a clear paranoia around ever giving their real opinions too, because they thought someone could be listening. Another element of their overall operating system which affected their approach to their job was the gamification of their lives. No thought was ever given to their own human experience. There was no pursuit of anything of deeper significance than surface-level metrics. Food was an unnecessary cost, so they would eat the cheapest slop imaginable. They wore the same outfits over and over again because buying clothes was a pointless expense. Deodorant, not a chance. One of my coworkers had been at the company for nearly 4 years, and throughout that whole time, he lived in the rundown apartments right beside the office where the company actually housed the summer interns. Why would he pay $1,500 for rent when he could pay $600 instead? So he would pretend to work for 12 hours, drive home for 2 minutes, continue to pretend to work, but now from home, send remittances to India, then come back the next day. If there was a work happy hour, their attendance was always for a reason. Perhaps a manager was going. They had entirely divorced their existence from their lives. They were controlling a video game character, completely sidestepping the human experience. And because of all this, the company culture dissolves entirely. But I think what struck me about this gamification is that it is so similar to what is being demanded of us by the liberal world order. There is a desperate attempt to sell us on economic and propositional bonds as the basis of our society, rather than bonds of heritage. Women especially are convinced that this type of corporate slavery will provide maximal meaning and purpose. The emphasis was taken entirely away from family, religion, community, and instead fixed upon what our nation's GDP is. They tell us to prioritize our money and career at the expense of everything else. But my country is not an economic zone, and nobody is entitled to this country because they work hard. I don't care that you wake up and go to work on time each morning. That is not now, nor has ever been a factor in the composition of a national identity. And even if you want the best and the brightest, I can tell you now, we don't have them. So we still need a new system given the failing outcome. America is also not entitled to the greatest minds in the world. The tech right frames it as self-evident that we need the world's most talented. And they'll say, of course we need to integrate these international geniuses so America can be the best. That, again, is only a reasonable conclusion if you value economic and ideological bonds for your society. I reject that. I want, firstly, bonds of heritage. And if the maintenance of a shared heritage costs the country some money in the short term, that's fine with me. But the secret is, it actually won't, because returning these immigrants will be an objective win in nearly every category. The propositional nation has failed, and the strong gods will return to our society. But what is so troubling about Trump's new decree is that it is yet again another example of failing to grasp the nettle. For anyone not aware, the nettle plant is essentially a weed which has a small stinging hair on its leaves. If you gently touch these hairs, it pricks you, but if you're firm and grasp it, the hairs will retract and it will feel soft. What Trump is doing, and what he has done so many times before, is touching the nettle as opposed to grasping it. The administration has put tremendous effort in and disrupted alliances, but failed to achieve a successful outcome, while still getting all the negative press that they otherwise would, even if the action was deliberate and swift. Caroline Leavitt even clarified that the new H-1B rules, in fact, will only do maybe 10% of what they should. This is not the way to wield power. Half measures do far more harm than doing nothing at all. And if we continue to still get all the worst possible press coverage just from implementing objectively benign legislation, then what exactly is holding us back from enacting real change?